So it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Kidby, who's here for the first time, but Dan's certainly not a novice at activism, and he's going to be sharing some of his experience with us. Dan was on the Sea Shepherd in Australia, has done a whole range of activism involved in the anti-fracking movement in Australia in the past as well. And I know you could speak about a whole range of things, but we thought it'd be really useful today for Dan to share some of his thoughts around what the civil rights movement has to offer in terms of lessons or experience to the anti-fracking movement. I think we've all recognised that we're in this for the long game and we're not going away until this whole thing goes away, and that could take a while yet, but we're going to be here. And so there's lessons from long-term civil rights social movements from history that we can learn from. So I just want to say we're very delighted in Lancashire because Dan's recently moved up from Brighton, so I think what's Brighton's loss is going to be Lancashire's gain. So thanks for coming today, and we look forward to seeing you here in the future as well. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you. I've never gave a talk in this kind of setting before, so hopefully my voice is loud enough. Can people hear? Yeah. Okay, cool. So just before I start, I mean, it's just important to recognise, I'm going to be looking at the civil rights movement in the United States, looking at a lot of the activity that was going on, particularly in the early 1960s. And people have defeated bigger armies of cops than that in the past. They've defeated more aggressive armies of cops in the past, and by looking back at these stories we can get a lot of inspiration and we can get a lot of strategic guidance to really inform us so that we can win this battle and battles to come in the future. So for me, over the last couple of years I've been really interested in the question of how do we build big social movements. And with that in mind, I co-founded a group called the Radical Think Tank, which is a network of campaigners, academics and activists to kind of come together to look at groups on the ground today, see how they're organising, inform people about democratic processes, about strategic processes, and kind of get real world live feedback about what works and what doesn't work. And what we also have done is gone back and researched into the social movements of the past. So whilst I'm going to be talking about the civil rights movement today, it's important that the lessons that we can take from it, I could be talking about any of the major social movements in the past. I could be speaking about the Indian independence movement that Gandhi is known for. I could be speaking about the Eastern Bloc revolutions, like the Serbian revolution against Milosevic, where people within 2 years are able to topple him. Or I could be speaking about the Arab Spring, because the dynamics that take place within these movements, the strategies, they're so vastly similar, and we're at a stage where it's a matter of applying ideas to different contexts. It's like the strategies and the ideas, they're already there and we can learn so much. We don't need to keep trying to reinvent the wheel. So first of all, I'd say, I've known about Preston New Road for a long time, and I'm just majorly inspired by what you've been doing here for the last years. It's incredible. I mean, you don't really go for very long in the activist scene in England before you start hearing the stories that come back. So just thank you so much for everyone. I was actually I was over at the fracking sites in Australia, a place called Pilliga Forest, where they were doing exploratory drilling, and the devastation there was absolutely horrendous. They were there flaring 24 hours a day at about 40 different sites, and your eyes would burn from the methane in the air. It was so bad. And there was this bright green toxic water that had flooded down, and there was just devastation where this water had flowed. All the trees were dead. It was just absolutely despicable. And for me, not only am I do stuff around human rights and environment, but I'm also an animal rights activist as well. And so for me, it's not only humans that are getting impacted by this, but all of the wildlife are all individuals, and all, when they go and drink that toxic water and then die, they're suffering training. Yeah, their suffering is really close to my heart as well. So yeah, thank you, and I look forward to this being a long battle that we are going to win.
Winning.
We are, yes.
We will win.
Yeah.
They haven't fracked in 7 years, we're doing okay.
Yeah.
We're winning.
So, yeah, and so looking at the civil rights movement, just a very quick nod as well, that the black liberation movement still continues on to this day, and like racism is still a massive issue in this country and also internationally. So I'm going to kind of take us back to the American South back in 1960, and just for a bit of context, at this time, well, I mean, it was just an incredibly dangerous time to be a black person at this time in the American South. Lynchings were commonplace. Segregation was everywhere, and as a black person, they would have, signs quite clearly labelled "whites only, you're not allowed in here." And if people did transgress those rules, they would get beaten up, they would get arrested, and they would at times be lynched. To be an activist at those times was especially dangerous, and there are many instances throughout the civil rights movements where people were getting their houses firebombed, where people were getting beaten up and killed in the streets just when they're walking home late at night. And yet in that hostile climate, people were still able to gain masses and masses of power to make change. So however much we think we're up against it, just know that it could be a lot worse. I normally have a PowerPoint for this, so I'm just going through my slides just to keep me guided. Okay, so Nashville in 1960. So here was a scene of such tremendous protest, where you had in the end 98% of the black community in that area rising up in protest. And the story begins with a guy called James Lawson. Now, James Lawson, he's a reverend, and he had travelled over to India, and he'd spent 3 years studying non-violent civil resistance. And he'd been learning from the Indian independence movement, and he'd been learning from a lot of stuff against the Nazis in Denmark and in Finland, and also within Germany itself, and learning from all of these stories of resistance, studying the strategies. So he spent 3 years doing this, and then came back to America, where he then placed himself in Nashville. And he spent between 4 and 5 months running close to the university these trainings on non-violent resistance, and he brought in all these fresh young activists, all of it in their early 20s, and every week they would meet and they would study these theories and study the strategies. And he effectively took these people from being brand new activists who hadn't done that much before in their lives to being just some of the most powerful people in the movement that went and were there as key figures in the passing of the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and many other major pieces of legislation that they were able to win. And what he taught them was, he taught them a theory of power, that basically any political power depends intimately on the people's cooperation. No power can stand unless if we ourselves choose to cooperate with it. And as soon as we can break through that fear barrier, and as communities rise up and say no, then that's it, and we've won. Because once there's masses of people doing that, then that's game over. So the goal, so for him, teaching them that theory of power was about how do we get to that stage where people feel empowered enough to do that themselves. So what he taught is that we need to, by breaking these laws, these unjust laws, by taking this action, we can highlight and we can dramatize these situations of injustice, and in that way we can get, the idea is to get the media to these sites where it's just real sites of major disobedience, where you know, they create situations where they want to break the law, and the cops will come, they will arrest them, they will beat them up, in order to bring the media there and to draw attention to this issue and inspire others to take action themselves. And so in these trainings, he was engaging in all sorts of non-violent resistance training, direct action training, so that people would know that if they do get attacked and do get insulted by people, then they're going to be there keeping their cool. Like, he would have people stand up and they would experiment by hurling abuse at each other, just like we might receive from the cops today. And so people would remain cool and not fight back.
That's a man who was threatened with arrest for beeping down. And since then, he does this all the time because they threaten to arrest him for beeping.
Really?
And so he brings convoys of beepers.
There you go. Civil disobedience comes in many different forms. Yeah, and through these trainings, what they also did is they developed really strong bonds and became really close, so that when they could come to the time when they took action, they could do that together and have strong trust. So after 4 or 5 months of this training, they set themselves onto strategizing. So they looked at the situation of their city of Nashville, and they looked at what the most pertinent issue there was. And they saw that for the people living there, it was segregation. The humiliation of not being able to go into certain places and to be removed from certain places was by far the thing which they felt would inspire people to take action against it. They felt it was the most heartfelt thing for the people living in that community. But they realized that just a big demand like end segregation, like they're never going to be able to mobilize enough people with such a big thing. And it's the same, like you could look at like end fracking. It's almost too big of a demand to get people involved, because people look and they go, how can we possibly win that? Like, it's so big. So instead, they wanted to be able to symbolize that demand of end segregation. So they honed down into a particular area, and what they felt was one of the most humiliating aspects of segregation was at the lunch counters. So in America, they used to have these long counters, and people would go and order lunch there and sit on these long counters. But for the black people, they would have to take their food outside. So they said, you know what, we're just going to go and have a tactic where we're just going to break this rule, and we're going to sit there and we're going to eat, and we're going to go there in a big group, and we're not going to leave. And the idea was that we're going to win this battle, we're going to make it so that we can eat here, and that's going to get more people involved and motivate us to bigger and bolder battles. So it's important to recognise that this action that they were doing was so extremely controversial, by going into the lunch counters and just sitting there. I don't know what an equivalent would be today, but I mean, like, as a black person, like, the people who first ever did this tactic, they were told that they were making the black race look bad by their own people. Because it was so transgressive of social norms, but they said, you know what, we know that this is what it takes. So even though we're going to be getting criticism from our own people left, right and centre, we're going to convince them that this is the right way to go about things. And so they just held firm and went for that protest tactic. So if people were ever saying, like, you know, that's too disruptive, you're going too far there, just consider that people have said that before and they've been wrong. So yeah, what they're doing is engaging in non-violent direct action. And there's a quote from Martin Luther King. And what he says is, non-violent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to dramatise the issue so that it can no longer be ignored. So that's the purpose behind non-violent direct action. So before they went and actually engaged in this tactic, they really thought deeply, how is it going to be received? And they came up with every objection that they could think about. They thought that people would say to them that they expected, like, the white racist population to say, we don't want to sit next to say we don't want to sit next to black people, because they were anticipating objections like them saying that they're going to be dirty and all kinds of other things. So as part of their strategy, they thought deeply and they said, okay, we're going to go in there and we're going to be the best dressed people in that place. We're going to go in there with our school books. So that, because what they were really interested in is public opinion. How can they make public opinion be most in their favour? And so every tiny detail they thought about. And that's something that often gets missing in direct action today. Often people get an idea and then they say, oh yeah, let's go do it. But these people spent weeks planning it and finessing it so it would be perfect. So they were finally ready, and on the 13th of February of 1960 in the afternoon, a group of, I think it was about 20 of them, went in and sat in the lunch counters. And by doing this, the people who worked there were faced with a dilemma. They can do one of two things. They either, one, is they let them eat there, in which case they've won, or they beat them up and they kick them out and get them arrested, which causes the drama that these people are trying to create. And that's known as a dilemma action. You want to put the person that you're up against in a lose-lose situation. They either lose by letting them eat there, or they lose by causing a massive scene and getting the media all over it and allowing them to gain power. The first time, they just shut the shop down, and they just said, you know what, like, and then they just let them stay for the day, but they just closed the doors because they didn't want white people to get offended. Week on week, they went back. This wasn't just a one-off process, but they just kept going back and back again, and each time with greater numbers, because people would see this and they would get inspired by it. And by the third time, they were ready to go to 6 of these lunch counters. And they went there, they ordered their food and they sat down. But this time, the violence that they were expecting finally happened. So, the people at the cafe, the white people, pulled them off their seats, they beat them up, they dragged them out and they got arrested. But they were ready for this and they had the media lined up to be there to film it. And these pictures went nationwide. There's a quote by Martin Luther King that says, "We will wear you down by our capacity to suffer." So these people, even though they did get beaten up and even though they did get arrested, they found great pride in that. And they had quotes like, they had chants like, "Jail, no bail," and "Fill the jails," because they knew by going and filling these jails and building this scene, then it was going to make massive impacts. And the willingness of the young people to sacrifice themselves in these acts of protest absolutely inspired the local population. And what happened was, after that protest that day, you had massive amount of people coming up to the prisons and to the jailhouses and coming up, engaging in solidarity protests and asking for ways to support the movement. And what they did is they were prepared for this massive influx of people. Often what happens nowadays is if we get a whole load of people who want to get involved, we don't have a clue of what jobs to give them or anything. And then we get all a bit fumbled and then people get disenchanted and they leave. But because they'd already engaged in this long-term strategy in advance, they already expected this influx. So they had prepared to have a boycott of the entire downtown shopping area. And they also had picket lines as well arranged. So people, no matter who they were, whether they're old grandmas or young children, could get involved in the protest as well. So what happened was that you actually had 98% of the black population in Nashville engaging in a boycott of the downtown district, which is massive and was a massive economic hit to the town. And whilst this was going on, still week on week they were going back with more and more people doing those sit-ins because they weren't going to let it lie, and week on week they were getting beaten up and they were getting arrested. Then what happened is, because there was so much activity, because such a scene was created, is that the opposition started getting active, and you started having the white supremacists in the area, the really hardcore white supremacists, started coming out and protesting themselves. And this is what often happens, is once you start making a big enough stink, like the right wing will rise up as well. And by polarizing the public and getting that right wing to spring up, what they do is they alienate the rest of the people, because they do campaigns that are so egregious and so over the top that people, whereas before they may have been neutral on the issue, say that they don't want to be associated with those people and they want to be associated with you know, the black population instead. And so this is what happened. They range from protests to doing mock lynchings. Studied social movements from the last 100 years and looked to see how successful they were, and by an absolute mile, non-violent civil disobedience was the way to achieve change. And amongst successful revolutions, not only was non-violent the most likely to achieve, but also it was the most likely to create stable democratic systems afterwards as well. So by engaging in non-violent civil disobedience, it's democratic, it gives a diverse group of people to get involved, and it creates stable systems for after our victories as well. Next one is disruption. And as you all know, being here, disruption works, but we also need to take disruption to the streets, because once we start impacting on the natural order of things, on the status quo and on people's lives, then that's when change happens. That's when the politicians do actually respond. Sacrifice is really important as well. What these people did by protesting in the way that they did was that they put their bodies on the line, and that invoked people to have a natural sense of sympathy, which led them to stand up in solidarity. And when people see someone believing in something so much that they're willing to put themselves in harm's way, that's what movements are made. That's what movements are made of. And Gandhi knew that very well as well. The next one is escalation. By going back week on week on week with more and more people, they were escalating their form of protest, now getting bigger and bigger each time, and then they went on to different tactics which are more and more disruptive, like the big mass marches and the boycotts. So by planning your campaign to have an arc that goes like this, rather than just doing odd actions here and there, is absolutely essential to victory. So when you're going to be engaging on a campaign, to be prepared that you want to have a block of time where you want to be heavily engaged. Another one is love. It sounds a bit silly, but you know, when the cops come, shouting at the cops is a way to really damage your cause, because or anyone, any kind of opposition, what the protest movements have done so well, and what the civil rights movement has done well, is that they went in, they were firm in their beliefs, but they were the most kind and respectable people to the people to who they were protesting. And what that did is, when they were able to win and pressure those people to change their policies, what they had is natural allies, because they hadn't made enemies of those people. And people in protest movements in the past have shown love in all kind of different ways. This isn't about being friends and saying we're going to be the best of mates, but it's just showing a common decency to people. So really trying to cool your anger and speak to people as human beings, and speak to the cops as not the uniforms that they are, but the people underneath. That's how we can win support for our campaigns. Because if people see us being angry, and if people see us shouting, then people don't also want to come and stand next to us, however much that anger feels legitimate.